The car market is absolutely changing and prices aren't where they were, say, in 2021. But the thing is, not all car prices are changing at the same rate. In fact, some cars are changing much faster than others, like a lot faster. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down some of the cars that have depreciated the most in the last couple of months. These are cars that you should absolutely pay attention to if you're somebody who's looking to buy them, not only because the used market could be a great opportunity to find an amazing deal at a below market value price, but it also means that these are cars that you should probably avoid buying new altogether. So let's get started. Now, let's start with the most obvious one on this list. This is one where if you even pay a little bit attention to the car market and used car prices, you probably know which one this is, and that's Tesla. Over the last year, Tesla have lost more than 33% of their value, and this includes all Tesla models, not just a single type. It's interesting because electric vehicles historically do not hold their values well. In fact, you will see throughout this video that some of the worst depreciating vehicles are in fact electric vehicles. But historically, Tesla actually hasn't fit into this category. Teslas are not cars that have been plagued with poor depreciation. In fact, Teslas have historically been known as cars that hold their value quite well, which means that you can imagine the surprise for Tesla owners whenever they buy a new Tesla in 2022, thinking that they're making a relatively fine financial decision, only to be smacked with the reality of price cuts only a few months later. A series of price cuts, the EV tax credits, as well as a waning car market and increased competition in the EV space has certainly hurt Tesla's resale value, with price cuts absolutely having the largest impact here. Today, you can buy a used Model 3 for around 30 grand, with the Model S, Y, and X ranging from $40,000 to $50,000 depending on the model, year, mileage, and trim. And this is a steep discount from not only where these cars are new, but also where these cars were used in 2022. And again, this is something that I really sympathize with Tesla owners on, because I know that depreciation rate is something that buyers take into account whenever they're buying a new car. I know that I do. And given the fact that historically Teslas have held their value pretty decently, especially compared to other cars on the market, I can imagine buying a Tesla having a certain expectation whenever it came to depreciation, only to have price cuts happen just a few months later and then the value of your car absolutely shoot down to the ground. It'd be frustrating. In fact, I recently saw a Reddit post from someone saying that a new Model X that was purchased in 2022 was the worst financial mistake that they've ever made in their life. And I'm sure that this is something a lot of Tesla owners have also experienced. Next on the list is, you guessed it, another electric vehicle, and this one is Polestar, specifically Polestar 2. Polestar 2 is the EV arm of Volvo, and with the Polestar 2, you can conclude that the Polestar is sort of going after both the Model 3 and Model Y customers, as well as the Mach-E customers. The Polestar 2 is an odd car because it feels larger than a sedan, certainly larger than a Model 3, but it also doesn't feel as large as a Model Y or a Mach-E, even though space-wise it's very similar. I actually just recently test drove a Polestar 2, and I really enjoyed the design, the drivability, the simplicity. I was extremely impressed with the vehicle. But with an MSRP of between $50,000 and $60,000 depending on the trim level, this is a car that I think is a bit too pricey for what you get, especially considering the fact that the power and range are not as good as Tesla. But used, this is where Polestar 2s are actually an incredibly reasonable price. Polestar 2s have depreciated by 35% this year, bringing the average purchase price of a Polestar to 37 grand. But as someone who is considering buying one, you can actually find a launch edition for around the low 30s, which I think is a solid deal. But unlike Teslas, Polestars do not have an historical record of holding their value. In fact, Polestars are a relatively new brand, and the Polestar 2 was just released in the last couple of years, so their track record for value retention is actually pretty bad. Like, sort of horrendous. So the biggest takeaway here with the Polestar is that unless you have a ton of money, like enough to burn or flush 30 grand down the toilet without feeling a thing, it's probably not a good idea to buy a Polestar 2 new. Instead, I would opt for used, and that's where you can get a really solid deal. Now, I did take a few liberties when constructing this list for this video because whenever I was doing research, I found that the cars with hands down the worst depreciation are almost all electric vehicles. In fact, they are all electric vehicles. From Mercedes to Kia, Porsche, Hyundai, BMW, Ford, Chevy, GMC, pretty much across the board, EVs have lost anywhere between 25 to 35% this year, with a few exceptions, one of which we will talk about later in this video. But I don't want this list to be just a bunch of different electric vehicles that you shouldn't buy new. I also want to include some gas vehicles as well. And so with that in mind, the Dodge Grand Caravan has a really poor value retention, and this year alone, it's lost 22% of its value. Dodges pretty much across the board don't hold their value great. Now, the Grand Caravan was discontinued back in 2020, which sort of makes this 22% depreciation rate even worse. Because unlike Tesla, Polestar, or many of the other electric vehicles that I mentioned a moment ago, these are cars that are still being produced brand new today. And so whenever you look at 2023 data for depreciation, it is going to be a little bit skewed because 2023 model cars are going to depreciate at a faster rate than, say, 2019 or 2020 or 2021 model cars. Cars just depreciate more in their first year. But because of the fact that Dodge Grand Caravans were discontinued in 2020, their newest model is actually 3 years old, which means that Dodge doesn't have the same skewed data. Dodge should theoretically have less of a depreciation rate compared to newer cars because they're not getting that instant depreciation hit in that first year of ownership. And by the third year, which is Dodge Grand Caravan's newest model at this point, depreciation should slowly start tapering off. But in Dodge Grand Caravan's case, it isn't, which means that the Dodge Grand Caravan is more than halfway through of what it should be in its largest depreciation drop, and yet it still went down 22% this year alone, which certainly isn't a good sign for the long-term appreciation and depreciation of the Grand Caravan. Now, for me, if I was looking for a minivan, I would probably buy a Toyota or potentially a Mazda 5. I'm a sucker for the Mazda 5. And you can't beat the price of the Mazda 5 on the used market. Next up is Lincoln. Now, I like Lincolns. I think they're extremely nice vehicles, but they hold their value surprisingly bad. Sure, if value isn't your number one concern and you're instead looking for American-made luxury, maybe Lincoln is the right choice for you. But pretty much across the board, with the exception of the Lincoln Navigator, Lincolns have lost more than double-digit percentage points of their value within the last year. Now, I do want to offer a disclaimer that Cadillac, which is one of Lincoln's biggest competitors, was also a contender to be on this list. Because like Lincoln, Cadillac also holds their value very poor. In fact, similar to Lincoln, most of Cadillac's lineup has depreciated in the double-digit percentage points. But the determining factor of which brand I was going to put on this list versus which one I was going to leave off was the Cadillac Escalade versus the Lincoln Navigator, and which one of these two cars depreciated the least. Both the Escalade and the Navigator are the best at holding their value for their respective brands. But unlike Lincoln, which has a 5% depreciation rate for the Navigator, the Cadillac Escalade actually appreciated in value by just over 0.25%. In fact, there were a few cars that actually appreciated in the Cadillac lineup, but under Lincoln, there were none. Like most cars, Lincolns are best used. They simply lose too much value, especially in this car market, and this year, Lincolns have lost anywhere from 10 to 22% of their value depending on the car, with the MKC being the biggest loser with a depreciation rate of 22%. Now, we do have one more electric vehicle to talk about. This could be arguably one of the worst depreciating cars in recent history, and funny enough, it's actually one of my favorite cars on the road today. And that is an Audi e-tron GT. The Audi e-tron GT is Audi's sportback 100% electric vehicle sedan. It has 4 seats, 4 doors, and I think this car is incredible. It looks extremely similar to a Porsche Taycan, which is Porsche's 4-door EV. The Audi e-tron has a starting MSRP of $106,000, and it can go up quite a bit from there depending on the trim level. And today, you can buy these cars for slightly above $60,000. And what's the craziest part about this is that the Audi e-tron GT has only been around since 2021, so these cars are only 2 years old, and yet you can buy them for only $60,000. That's a depreciation rate of about 40%. Now, if you look online, you'll find quite a bit of Audi e-tron GTs listed for around $60,000. You'll also find a handful that are listed for around $50,000, but those are pretty much all branded titles, many of which I noticed are lemons and buyback. But for a clean title, low mileage, 2021 or even a 2022 model e-tron GT, you can get that for around $60,000 to $65,000. And I expect that coming in 2024, this will drop even more. Now, this car is basically plagued of the worst of both worlds. An e-tron GT is an Audi, and Audis do not hold their value well because they're a luxury German brand and they never really have held their value well. But this is also an electric vehicle, and as we've spoke about in this video, electric vehicles depreciate a lot as well. And whenever it comes as to why this is the case, there are a few different reasons. EV technology is still very new and it's still in its infancy. As a result, as that technology progresses and gets refined, EVs are going to get cheaper. Not only that, but older, more outdated EVs may end up going down in value closer to that of an electronic device rather than a car. Sort of why you can buy an older iPod for like $10 on eBay. And of course, tax credits, rebates, incentives, these also play a factor as well, though not nearly as much as the technology. But truthfully, if this video tells you one thing, it tells you that you should really not, under any circumstances, buy an EV. There are a few scenarios where it could potentially make sense if you could get an EV tax credit, but in most cases, and for most people, it simply doesn't offset the cost of the accelerated depreciation. The fact is, EVs are depreciating at an unprecedented rate, and while cars are depreciating across the board pretty fast, gas-powered cars are still depreciating 5, 10, 15% less than their EV counterparts. So my advice to you is if you buy an EV, buy used. Like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.